My presentation today is going to be on the impacts of the British Empire on the Sikh community specifically. So just to start off the talk, I wanted to briefly introduce who the Sikhs are in a sense. And the Sikh way of life was founded in the late 15th century by Guru Nanak Dev Ji, the first Guru. Um, the Sikh, the term Sikh itself can be defined as to learn. And one of the main focuses of a Sikh would be to seek the timeless truth. Um, following the martyrdom of the fifth Guru, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, by the Mughal Empire, the Sikhs became heavily militarized as a population under the command of the sixth Guru, Guru Har Gobind Ji. And then following this, like the preceding years after that, there would be ongoing conflicts between various political powers, such as the Hil Raja, as well as the Mughal Empire itself and the Sikhs themselves, where several battles were then fought between the Mughal Empire and the Sikhs. And this ultimately led to the formation of the Khalsa in 1699 by the 10th Guru, Guru Gobind Singh Ji, which is essentially a community of initiated Sikhs who dedicate their lives to protecting and serving those who do not necessarily have the means to do so themselves. And this is a community that still operates and exists to this day. So yeah, that's just like a very brief introduction into who the Sikhs are. The Sikh Empire was actually something that followed in the late 18th century. So the 18th century saw the collapse of the Mughal Raj in Punjab at the time, and then it saw the rise of the Sikh Confederacy. As a result of that, the empire began, the Sikh Empire itself, I should say, began with the capture of Lahore by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The following decades of Ranjit Singh's rule saw that the people of the region prospered economically and culturally, and the rule itself was relatively secular in the sense that people from any communities, any backgrounds were given the opportunity to rise to positions of prominence. However, following the death of Ranjit Singh, turbulent times fell upon the empire, with many members of the royal family dying under suspicious circumstances, and then the outbreak of the Anglo-Sikh Wars. These wars were fought pretty brutally between the two powers, but it ultimately led to the annexation of the Sikh Raj by the British. And as you can see, that so the pictures I have here, this is Maharaja Ranjit Singh himself, and you can see that the control that the Sikh Empire had spans vastly across West and East Punjab as well. I did want to just make a little disclaimer here, the trigger warnings, that some of the following slides will contain depictions and descriptions of atrocities that were carried out by the British against members of the Sikh Empire. Yes, I just wanted to give a brief warning. I first wanted to start off talking about Bhai Maharaj Singh. So Bhai Maharaj Singh was a prominent Sikh leader during the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and then also after. He was one of the few commanders who refused to surrender to the British rule and had actually implemented a plan to reinstate Sikh rule in the region. However, he was informed on and subsequently arrested by the British Empire. Now, following their investigations, the British had determined that it would be way too dangerous to keep Maharaj Singh imprisoned in Punjab at the time. MacLeod, the then Commissioner of India, had reported, "I am convinced that Maharaj Singh is a remarkable person. He has all the attributes of a saint. He has an unusual self-control and self-confidence. He seems to have power to foresee the coming events and has qualities of a great leader whom people would like to obey." So as such, when they imprisoned him and then they exiled him to Singapore, the majority of their the incarceration that he then was subjugated to was actually a confinement in a cell with the windows bricked up, and no opportunities were given to go outside and exercise. He was literally kept in that cell for the remainder of his days. And despite many doctors recommending that they allow him the occasional walk in the open, the government of India actually rejected this proposal, and as such, his health continued to deteriorate. After 3 years of this imprisonment, Maharaj Singh had actually lost his sight, and several other ailments had developed. And the reason I wanted to focus on this specific example was this is almost like an example that could be used to showcase the wider treatment of the British Empire on any peoples who have ever resisted their rule. This was done to crush the spirit of Bhai Maharaj Singh, and as such, it's a particularly extraordinary example of cruelty from the British Empire. There was no reason for them to keep someone locked up in a prison cell with the windows blocked up. The next example I want to talk about was the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So this massacre actually took place a mere 5 months after the end of World War I, which saw thousands of millions of Indian soldiers, but also thousands of Sikh soldiers participate in and also dying as well. And the actual massacre itself took place on the 13th of April in 1919, which also was Vaisakhi, the day that Sikhs celebrate to commemorate the birth of the Khalsa. In the lead up to the massacre, tensions were really high in the region with the increased agitation against the British Raj. Specifically, there was growing dissent as a result of the Rowlatt Act, which allowed the state to prosecute political cases without juries and permitted the internment of suspects without trial. It was proclaimed by Dyer and others in the administration that crowds of more than 4 people in the city of Amritsar had been banned. However, this notice was not well disseminated throughout the area, and as such, people had still congregated to celebrate. Firstly, to celebrate Vaisakhi as we do, where we have fairs and festivals and we have large gatherings, but also secondly, some groups had peacefully congregated to peacefully protest the deportation of 2 nationalist leaders who were seen as dissenters by the officers in charge. This man on the right, as you can see, is Reginald Dyer. He is the person who essentially ordered this attack or massacre. He actually made no attempts to peaceably disperse the crowd in this enclosed bog, which is essentially like a garden. So it's a walled garden with a few different exits. So he had actually blocked up the exits and sent troops in to where and basically cornered the people that were there, left them no routes of escape. And he did this with the intent to punish the Indians for their disobedience. And when the order to fire was given, his troops were ordered to fire into the densest parts of the crowds so as to inflict the maximum number of casualties on the people who were there. The British government subsequently tried to suppress the information about this massacre and actually initially reported it as a violent clash between rebels and authorities. Dyer was not court-martialed or treated as a murderer, as he was deemed to have been acting upon the orders of the military and essentially was not really court-martialed for that. Next slide. So the next example I wanted to bring up was the Rawalpindi experiments, and these were carried out before and during the Second World War, starting in the 1930s. They did last for more than 10 years, and it was essentially where British scientists from Porton Down used mustard gas on hundreds of Indian soldiers from the Indian Army. The scientists at Rawalpindi sent British to Indian soldiers wearing shorts and cotton shirts into gas chambers to experience the effects of mustard gas. The scientists hoped to determine the appropriate dosage to use on battlefields, essentially. Many of the subjects suffered severe burns and from the exposure of this gas. The interesting thing about this is Porton Down is actually a military installation in the UK that still operates to this day. And actually Porton Down officials, since this story broke, have since actually argued that seeing that these trials took place in a different era during a conflict, therefore we can't really judge that by today's standards, which I find as almost as like a recurring theme when it comes to assessing the impacts of the British Empire. So from there, I wanted to move on to post-independence India. So India is essentially a colonial project, and it actually remains fractured still to this day due to the various sectarian tensions that were extremely exacerbated by the British rule. One of them, and this is particularly true for people in Punjab, especially the Sikhs as well. For example, the language has been suppressed by the Indian government in certain parts of our history. There was oppression and subversion of the Sikh faith itself that was due to various government legislation. And I also wanted to highlight that India has one of the highest numbers of active separatist groups as a nation. And I think that is a result of many different peoples from India not feeling represented by the nation itself. So as a result of those separatist groups, India has actually introduced various laws such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which essentially gives military personnel free rein to do whatever they need without fear of prosecution. And these laws and acts have been highly criticized by various human rights organizations, and the UN has actually, in fact, asked the Indian government to revoke this act as it's been cited as undemocratic. So yeah, moving on from there, I wanted to briefly talk about Operation Blue Star. So just as like a brief disclaimer, this is a really complicated topic, and there are a multitude of different factors at play here that are really difficult to really go into in just a minute. So I wanted to just focus on the British aspect itself. So to briefly explain what Operation Blue Star was, it was a military operation that was carried out in early June 1984. And it was essentially carried out to remove various Sikh leaders and their followers from the Harmandir Sahib complex, which is actually the holiest shrine for Sikhs as a nation, as a community. The army actions had actually led to the deaths of at least 5,000 people, which they have highly contested to this day. Various estimates put this number as higher, but I think the average is that it's at least 5,000 people. The reason I want to talk about this specific example was because the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, had actually supported the actions of the Indian government by not only sending military advisors to aid in the planning and the execution of the operation itself, but then also in the suppression of protests that followed the operation from the Sikh community. And she had an overwhelming support for the then Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi. So in the present day, I want to kind of bring up that, so from Operation Blue Star to the actions of India, but then also the wider actions of the British Empire, the present day, we can see that the impacts of empire are still felt to this day. And actually, the government of Britain still acts in a way that is detrimental to the Sikh community. For example, there have been several cases in the UK where members of the diaspora of the Sikh community in the UK have been targeted by police raids. I wanted to bring up the case of Jagtar Singh Johal, who is a British national who has been imprisoned since 2017 without charge and has actually been subjected to various methods of torture. I'm not even sure what crime he's actually been accused of, but I did want to highlight that his arrest wasn't necessarily an arrest in India. He had a hood thrown over his head and he was thrown into the back of a van, so no due process, and he hasn't been given any due process since then. And there have been various actions by various MPs here in the UK who have called for a higher sense of urgency from the UK government to do something on his behalf to kind of get him back home. But that has been largely ignored by the established power in the UK. I also wanted to highlight that Boris Johnson has recently set up an anti-extremist task force to deal with extremist Sikh elements in the UK at the behest of the Indian government, which I think is heavily damaging from the UK to support essentially a foreign country's interests against British citizens. And I see it as highly undemocratic. And I think that when we actually kind of assess this as a legislation that the Boris Johnson has now put forward, it will actually probably lead to an increased risk to anyone here who tries to speak out against any sort of atrocities being committed in India in any way. But essentially, I wanted to like conclude that from the legacies of empire itself have been largely negative for the Sikh community, but also the wider Indian population. From the decimation of the Indian textiles industry to the Bengal famine, Britain's legacy in the subcontinent has led to generational trauma that many Indians to this day still have to deal with. This isn't necessarily just isolated to the Sikh community, but it is particularly true for the Sikh community, as you can see in the treatment of our community leaders as well as other prominent figures to the identity crisis that we've been dealing with over the last 100 years. And also even with partition, which is again another complicated topic that I myself decided not to speak about today, but partition saw the loss of the historic Sikh homeland and the loss of access to historic Sikh sites from India to Pakistan. I also wanted to highlight that Britain's legacy in India saw that communal tensions were highly exacerbated by the Raj itself, which we then still deal with to this day. And personally, I think the different communities from the Indian subcontinent, that includes Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, we really need to, as a whole, reconcile with the impacts of empire and try and start dialogues to kind of bridge these gaps that were widened by the British, and hopefully try and build a more peaceful subcontinent. Thank you. That's my talk for today. And thank you, James, for having me on.